Well, good morning. Happy Holy Day. What an awesome day. The Day of Atonement. It is filled with so much symbolisms that we could talk about this day for days. I'm not going to talk for days. But I am going to talk about some of the symbolisms and things of this day. And it all has great significance. And from the very beginning, I want us to understand, I've made this statement. I don't know if I originally heard it from somebody else or what, but anyway, a statement, and that is the Day of Atonement is not just an inconvenience day on the way to the Feast of Tabernacles. I want us to know, and I'm not saying you don't know it, but I want to state it. There would be no need for the Feast of Tabernacles if we didn't have the Day of Atonement. There would be no need for the Day of Atonement if we didn't have trumpets, or trumpets if we didn't have, and you know where I'm going, with all of the holy days. It's one, then the other, then the other, then the other, and God is so awesome, He's worked it all out. And then He inspired people through the Holy Spirit to write it down so that we could get it. And that was in the Old Testament. Then He brings it forward, and then I think Paul, the writer of Hebrews, explains a lot of the symbolisms, and he goes back. And so we're going to see some of this. We're going to see actually a lot of this. And so as we celebrate this Feast of God, I want us to begin back where it all began for us, and us meaning humans. And of course, that's back in the Garden of Eden. Back where Adam and Eve sinned, and when they were driven out of the garden, when they were driven away from the tree of life. And in essence, they were driven away from the presence of God. And before we get into this, and we're going to immediately get into this, I want to give the title, and I have entitled this, A Great Day for Rejoicing. A great day for rejoicing. So with that in mind, please go with me to Genesis chapter 3, where we start as God removes Adam and Eve from the garden. It's in verse 24. Genesis 23, verse 24. So God, drove out the man, and of course we know that the reason He was driving him out was because of sin. That was the reason. That comes before, but we know that. And God, placed at the east of the garden cherubim and a flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. Now we know that it's because of sin. And we know sin, as a result of sin, we know there are sacrifices and offerings that took place. We see no sacrifice for sin in the story. Yet, a sacrifice can be inferred, I believe, from verse 21. So go up to verse 21. And the Lord God made for Adam and his wife garments of skins and clothed them. I think that is inferring there was a sacrifice to cover their nakedness, which is not sin, but it is symbolic in this context of because they were not covered. That's why the sin. And then by chapter 4, we see sacrifice as being a very important point of man's life. We see this through the story of Cain and Abel. If we really think about it, the story centers on sacrifice. It appears the fruit of the ground was not an acceptable sacrifice before God. Rather, an animal sacrifice, a sacrifice of blood was acceptable, and that's what God was wanting. So let's go to Genesis 4, beginning in verse 3. Genesis 4:3. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat, or the best thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but not unto Cain and his offering. He had not respect, and Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. Now, was this a precursor of a holy day, a commanded assembly in some way? We don't have all the story. We don't have it all. And I can't answer that yes or no. I lean in one direction, and you can lean in whatever direction you want to, because one day I think we'll probably find out. But continuing on, then, as I mentioned earlier, in the book of Hebrews, you may want to put a marker. We're going to be coming right back to Genesis, but I want us to go to Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 4. Hebrews 11 and verse 4. By faith, Abel's offering unto God was a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he, Abel, was righteous. And so what we see is faith was and is a part of offerings or sacrifices. We can use that interchangeably. And then back in Genesis, the Genesis story also shows altars became part of sacrificing and offerings. For example, we read that after the flood, Noah built an ark to the Lord. So let's go to Genesis chapter 8 and verse 20. Genesis 8, verse 20. And Noah built an ark unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. So there were sacrifices, there were offerings. Then in Genesis chapter 12 and verses 7 and 8, we're not going to read it, but there were two separate altars, and that we can assume that sacrifices and or offerings, and we see that they were built by Abram. We call him Abraham. But I do want you now to go to Genesis 13 and verse 4. Genesis 13 and verse 4. Unto the place of the altar which he, Abraham, had made, there the first, in other words, that's what I'd referred to back in chapter 12, where he made the altar. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Then we see when Abram moved to Hebron, he built another altar, and we assume sacrifices were involved. It's 13 in verse 18. And then Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord. And then, of course, we know by the time we get to Genesis chapter 22, we know that story, another altar was built. This is the story where in verse 9 it says that the sacrifice was involved, but this is where he was going to sacrifice his son Isaac upon the altar. And of course we know God provided a ram as a substitute sacrifice or altar or offering. All of this is symbolic, brethren. All of this is symbolic. And what does it have anything to do with the Day of Atonement? Absolutely. Absolutely. But I want to keep going because I want to build on this to drive this point across what God has done, that we have seen symbolism over and over and over and over and over. The Day of Atonement is not an insignificant day on the way to the feast. Later, we see Isaac Abraham's son, built an altar in Genesis 26 and verse 15. Then in Genesis 33, verse 20, Isaac built an altar and he named it. It says, LLO, Israel, or the God of Israel. And then in Genesis 35, verse 1, we find God told another altar to be built by Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel, who's a son of Isaac. So we're looking at 3 generations here where God had been involved and told them to make altars, and they do all of this. And I know you're asking, so what is the point of all of this? The point, brethren, is very clear. Altars, sacrifices, and or offerings and faith were all part of the men of God and women way back in the book of Genesis. These were important elements in their relationship to God. And yes, it is true, we don't have much information at all about any of the ceremonies or the rituals that attach to these early Genesis stories. We read what we read. And anything else, we're just kind of guessing at a lot of it. But we don't have. Yet, we do have, when Israel was brought out of Egypt, and we know that story, God identified himself to his people as the God who delivers from bondage. We see very clearly that sacrifices became very important and very detailed. A number of the Genesis stories involved sacrifices, offerings, altars, and of all these stories, it is not clear which, if any, are related to the Day of Atonement. But you know, brethren, perhaps in some ways, if we really think about it, all of them are. So this day is extremely important. This day is extremely important. I mean, here's the point why I'm saying maybe, perhaps, in some way all of them are. As we know, sacrifices were associated with every holy day in Leviticus 23, and we know 2 of these festivals of God involve very specific sacrifices. Passover, which is not a holy day, but it is a festival of God, and the Day of Atonement. And they both are very detailed, both of them. Are there similarities? Are there symbolisms between the 2? Absolutely. And brethren, over the years, we, the church, we have come to understand both of these major events, Passover and Days of Unleavened Bread, actually refer to the same sacrifice, Jesus' blood. Yet, each one is described in a very different from a very different perspective. You see, God designed and carefully laid out requirements of each of the holy days to foreshadow and to prophesy his plan of salvation for all of mankind. And it began with the Passover. And we need to remember, by the time of Jesus' earthly ministry, when he walked the earth as a flesh and blood and bone human being, and by the time of the early New Testament church, much of that plan had still been held in secret. Go with me, if you would, to 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter 1, verse 10. 1 Peter 1, verse 10. Of which salvation the prophets have inquired and searched diligently, who prophesied, who foretold of the grace that should come upon you. They wrote about it. They were inspired by the Holy Spirit. We know that. That's how the New Testament came about. Yet they did not understand. They wrote it down. They didn't understand it. But it says that should come unto you. Who is the you? The church, us. Verse 11. Searching what and what manner of time the Spirit of Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One, which was in them, did signify when it testified beforehand the sufferings of Christ and of the glory that should follow. They wrote about it. They didn't always understand it. I don't think they understood very much of it. But they wrote it down because God inspired them to do so. Unto whom it was revealed, not unto themselves, but unto us, that did minister the things which are now reported unto you by them that have preached the gospel unto you by the Spirit sent down from heaven, which things the angels desire to look into. It's telling us the Old Testament prophets didn't understand a lot of this. They wrote it down. They didn't understand it. We're also told, even to today in the New Testament, the angels want to learn about this. They don't understand all of it either. The timing of events is very, very important to God, and He reveals what He needs to reveal when it is right to do so. That's a very important principle. Even though Israel had the Scriptures and they observed the holy days, including the Passover and the days of unleavened bread and all of them, including the Day of Atonement, off and on for hundreds of years, they had no real idea what those days foreshadowed. And so I don't think we really can get really upset with all of, with Israel, because they're carrying out things, and we go, yeah, but they had God walking with them in the form of the being we refer to as Jesus Christ. And they should have just done it because of that. Yeah, that's easy for us to say. Now, but God got angry with them because they didn't do what He said to do. Now, that's another story, but how do we really get upset with them when they really didn't understand what they were doing? They were told to do it, they did it. They didn't understand it, and they grumbled. Does it ever remind us of any of us doing anything like that? Probably not. Wink, wink. They were caught up in the ceremonies, and they were caught up in the rituals. They had their own agenda, and they were absolutely absorbed, as it were, in their own history and traditions. And so they started adding to what God said to do. God allowed it, and some of it was symbolic, right, and they still didn't understand it. And of course we understand, I hope we understand that the Jews in Jesus' day did not understand, even though they saw the true Messiah walk among them. They didn't understand, even though they saw the true Passover. They didn't understand that. And so we take it for granted, they could have understood. They didn't understand. They did not understand for a whole lot of reasons, and that's not the point of the sermon. They did not understand the significance of the ripping of the veil of the temple. Yet, however, we, the Church of God, we can know these meanings. We can know all of this. Let me rephrase that. Let me take back the word all. We can understand a whole lot of it, not all of it, because I don't know that we understand all of it yet. So at this point, I want us to look a little closer to the Day of Atonement. So let's go back to Leviticus chapter 16. In Leviticus 16, we are told that lots are cast upon two goats. That's verses 7 and 8. I'm not going to read a lot of this, but we're going to read some. It says, one was for the Lord and the other was for Azazel, mistranslated as scapegoat. There may be something we could use with that, but let's just go on. So we know there are two goats. We know there are two goats. There's not one goat. And as we know, the goat for the Lord is killed, foreshadowing his being crucified at Passover. It was acted out year by year by year. And its blood is used in an atoning ritual. That's what we're told in verses 15 through 18. Then following the atoning or the reconciliation, the other goat is taken by the high priest, and it says, on all the iniquities, all the sins of the people are confessed or placed on the head of this other goat. This other goat does represent Satan. Now, I'm not even going to go in and try and prove all of that today. It's not part of this. I know that Mr. Pinkerman has covered some of this in times past and all. But I'm bringing it up because I know there are at least two Church of God groups that are teaching that both goats represent Jesus. Wrong, wrong, wrong. And I'll leave it up to Mr. Pinkerman to prove that to you, but it's not really hard. It's not really hard. Then going on, what we see is in a fit man or suitable man in the New King James, and then in Revelation 20 and verse 1 it says angel, and you go, what are you talking about? Well, that ties into the Day of Atonement if you really want to think about it. We'll get to that a little later. And then this fit man leads the goat into an inhabited wilderness. That's 21 and 22. This is symbolic of Satan's faith. And we need to remember that this is all symbolic. And symbolisms only go so far. You can't base all details of what's happening based upon the stories as they are, because they're symbolic of things, and symbolism only goes so far. And that's a very important point to understand, especially about the Day of Atonement. So, the rest of Leviticus chapter 16 shows offerings and washings being associated with the important central rituals. We know this, but I want us to notice that of all the holy days, the Day of Atonement is the only day God commands us to afflict our souls. So go to Leviticus 23 and verse 27. Leviticus 23, 27. Also on the 10th day of the 7th month shall be of the Day of Atonement. That's today. And it shall be a holy convocation unto you, and you shall afflict your souls, an offering made by fire unto the Lord. And you shall do no work in that same day, because it is a day of atonement, to make an atonement for you before the Lord your God. For whatsoever soul it be that shall not afflict the soul in that same day, he shall be cut off from among his people. And whatsoever soul it be that does any work in that same day, that soul will I destroy from among his people. Do we think God is serious about the Day of Atonement? Yeah, I think he's pretty serious. You shall do no manner of work. This is three different timings, three different wordings, three different points, three different verses saying the same thing. No work is to be done today. Got it? And there's reason for all of that. You shall no work at all. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations and all your dwellings. It shall be unto you a Sabbath of rest, and you shall afflict your souls. In the 9th day of the month at even, that started last night, from even unto even you shall celebrate your Sabbath. We see the Day of Atonement lasts from even to even, is what verse 32 says. We also notice it is a Sabbath of celebration. Some translations use the word in place of celebration, rest. You shall rest a Sabbath day. If you look up the Hebrew, the word celebration is an acceptable usage. Are we to be resting this day? Yeah, it's very plain. No work, no manner of work, no work at all. So we're not to be doing any work, right? So we're to be resting, but we're to be observing this day as a celebration. We have come to understand afflicting our souls to be fasting. And there are several passages that, if you have any questions, about fasting being regards to afflicting your souls, two very frequent ones that are used, and I'm not going to read them, but would be Isaiah 58 verses 3 and 5 and Psalm 35 verse 13. All Israel had to participate in the Day of Atonement to remain a part of God's people, to avoid being destroyed. Not just put out, but destroyed. Again, I ask, do you think God is serious about the Day of Atonement? With many practicing Jews today, the Day of Atonement is still considered as the most solemn and most somber day of the year, and they continue to fast. In fact, there are many secular Jews who don't do any of the holy days. They will fast this day because they were pretty much all Jews are taught from the very beginning, and then they become secular later. They were taught it from the very beginning, and so they understand. I don't want to be destroyed. I don't want to be cut off from God. How did they do this and they don't do the others? I don't know. I was in Israel. I asked a woman why she fasted on atonement, because she told me she did, and why did she keep the other days? And you know what? I still don't know what her answer is. And I don't think she does either. But anyway, it's interesting. Many devout Jews use the Day of Atonement as a day of remembrance and a day of repentance. It's where their behavior, in one way or another, is very similar to what we in the church, how we do and we demonstrate during the time leading up to Passover and the days of unleavened bread. They use it very, very in a similar way. And I've thought about this many times, and I've come to the conclusion, I think it's significant that these things happen. And the reason I think so is because they show how God is working with different people to accomplish His plan of salvation. They're not having to know everything now. Should they know everything now? Yes. They chose not to, so they don't. But He still uses it. He still uses these things, and that's significant to us. We know that the Church of God has been given much understanding and revelation of the Holy Day meanings, and we review the past and we understand much about the future. That's why we look at the symbolisms. That's why we pay so much attention to a lot of these things on this day. And so I want us to go back again to the book of Hebrews, because from the book of Hebrews we learn about the symbolism of the Day of Atonement. We read about it in Leviticus 16 and Leviticus 23 about there are these days, and they do, and we see some of the things, but we don't understand a lot of the information is not given about all of that. But in Hebrews, we see a lot of the symbolisms. So like for example, in Hebrews 10, we see that we, the church today, we are sanctified through the body of Jesus Christ. That's in Hebrews 10:10. By the which will we are sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. And we see the symbolism of that, yes, in Passover. We also see it through the symbolisms of the Day of Atonement. And brother, I hope we understand, without going into great detail about this, but I hope we understand this is showing us that we now have access to the Holy of Holies. We remember that it was also on the Day of Atonement that the high priest took the sacrificial blood into the Holy of Holies and only did it once a year. We know so much of this. A most holy place was in both the portable tabernacle and in the temple. They carried it out. Did they understand it? No, they did not understand. They did not understand. I know that there are times, because I've had people to ask me this before, so what did the Holy of Holies look like? Well, apparently the Holy of Holies was a small room, and there's a lot more detail we could go into than I'm even going to go in here. Apparently it was a small room that had walls and curtains, or curtain materials at least, and then inside this room was the ark, and then on the ark was the mercy seat where God appeared in a cloud above it. God associated the mercy seat with his presence being over the ark. Put a marker here in Hebrews, and let's go back to Leviticus 16 here. Leviticus 16 in verse 2. Leviticus 16 verse 2, and the Lord said to Moses, speaking to Aaron your brother, that he, Aaron, come not at all times, not just at any old time, into the holy place, within the veil before the mercy seat, which is upon the altar, which is upon the ark, that he die not. For I will appear in the cloud above the mercy seat. That's what Hebrews tells us. That's what this tells us. And then in Hebrews 9 in verse 2, we see what was before the holy place. Hebrews 9, going back to that, Hebrews 9 verse 2, for there was a tabernacle made, the first, wherein was the candlestick and the table and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. And so what we see in this Holy of Holies, we see a candlestick, we see a table, and we see showbread in the sanctuary or the holy place. Then in verse 3, this is in Hebrews 9 verse 3, behind the second veil was the tabernacle called the holiest of all. We're looking at what does it look like inside there? And you say, okay, so why are we reading this? Because of the symbolisms, brother, because of the symbolisms. Verse 9, still in Hebrews 9 and verse 4, it shows the Holy of Holies contains the golden censers and the ark with cherubim of glory shadowing or overshadowing the mercy seat. Their two wings are stretched out. Apparently, I've never seen it. I've seen it in drawings. You probably have too, and it could be accurate. Could be accurate. But it looks like at least a touch, you know. But anyway, over the mercy seat. And then the ark contained some manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tabernacles or the tablets of the covenant. Now, all of these are very interesting things, and each one of them carries spiritual significance. There's symbolisms in what is in all of this. The spiritual significance or principles that we can learn from the symbolisms are very important to the plan of God. So, manna demonstrates how God can and does take care of us. I mean, that's in there. And it underscores the importance of the Sabbath day, makes it very, very clear because it points out which day is the Sabbath, because it was a 40-year, every day, reoccurring miracle to point out which day is a Sabbath. Now, this is inside the ark. Aaron's bud that budded indicates how God works through authority that he gives to men. He showed all Israel the man in the office that he was backing. Of course, that was Aaron. And we know, of course, Aaron was not perfect. He wasn't anywhere close to being perfect. He was flesh and blood and bone, just like we all are. Yet, we still see very clearly that God was still making it very clear who he had appointed and who it was that he was backing up. He was doing things through this particular man, through this office that he was doing, high priest. Then the tables of the covenant, it appears to be the tablets written by the hand of God. I think we can see all of these things are very, very significant to us. And they're inside. And the high priest could only go in there once a year. And that once a year was when? The Day of Atonement. So all of this stuff has significance to the Day of Atonement. Again, Hebrews 9, it was made clear that the earthly tabernacle was made after the heavenly pattern. Verse 23, Hebrews 9:23. It was therefore necessary that the patterns of the things in the heavens should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. It's a pattern. It was patterned exactly like the one that is in heaven. Now, going on with some of the symbolisms from the Day of Atonement and tying it into the Passover, Jesus, who is the true high priest, he took his own blood into heaven before the mercy seat of God, not into the heavenly symbol of the pattern. Go to Hebrews 9, verse 24. For Christ is not entered into the holy places made with hands. He didn't go into, the temple. He carried his blood somewhere else. For Christ is not entered into the holy place made with hands, which are the figures or the patterns of the true from heaven, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Nor yet that he should offer himself often as the high priest entered into the holy place every year with blood of others. In other words, the offerings that he did. For then must he often have suffered such since the foundation of the world, but now once in the end of the world has he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Not going to go into this here, but other than to state that the Passover, the day of the wave sheaf during the days of unleavened bread, and the days of unleavened bread, all tied together with the Day of Atonement. Now, you could probably spend an entire sermon just on that one statement because there's so much to that, but I'm just making a statement. I just want to put it out there to get it stated. And of course, I know that we remember only the high priest could enter into the physical Holy of Holies and only once a year, and it was to take the blood of the sacrifice. And we also understand access was never granted to the people. And that's important. Because today, Because today, as true believers, as followers of Jesus Christ, we can enter through the veil into God's presence. Because Jesus has already taken His blood into God's presence, seen on the day of the wave sheaf back during the days of unleavened bread. This is why all of this is tied together. And we, the Church of God, now are allowed access. And this has all been so for some 2,000 years. The death of Jesus, the starting of the church. And I know that we look forward to the final fulfillment of the literal Day of Atonement, when all these things are actually carried out, where Satan will be bound for 1,000 years, and then access to God and His mercy seat will be granted to the entire world. And it's also interesting to know that there will be no need for any kind of special calling of them at that time, because following the real Day of Atonement, mankind will have, as a whole, will have access to God that very few people have ever had in the entirety of the 6,000 years of man on earth. We have it because of being part of the church. But the rest of mankind doesn't have that, and have not. But when this has happened. And so again, we make the statement, the Day of Atonement is truly a great day. And there is reason for both personal afflictions that lead us to humble the self, as well as to great celebration for what the Day of Atonement actually pictures symbolically or spiritually. Those who want to come to God after that Day of Atonement will be able to come to God. They will have access to the tree of life. The evil being who has held the world captive for 6,000 years will himself be the prisoner. Revelation 13 and verse 10. Revelation 13:10. He that leads into captivity shall go into captivity. That's the 1,000 years right after the end of the 1,000-year reign of Jesus Christ. No, that's not what I'm saying. For the 1,000 years at the beginning of it, right before Day of Atonement, that's the real Day of Atonement. He will be put into an abyss, and then there's the 1,000-year reign of Jesus Christ. And then we know He's loose for a little season, and we'll see that in just a moment. Ephesians 4 and verse 8. Ephesians 4, verse 8. Wherefore He says, and this is quoted from Psalm 68, verse 18, when He ascended up on high. Who ascended up on high? Jesus. He led captivity captive and gave gifts unto men. Satan will now be the one that is held in captivity. I started in the Garden of Eden, and man sinned, and they were driven out, and they were barred from access to the tree of life following those sins in the Garden of Eden. Then after the Day of Atonement, access is open once again. And brethren, please understand, the Day of Atonement is for the world, past, present, and future. This day is soon to be completely fulfilled. And we, the first fruits, the Church of God, we have access to God now by special calling. It's what Jesus said. No one can come to the Father through me. John 6:44. We have received atonement. We have received reconciliation to God. The world is waiting for it. So many of them most of them don't even understand. They probably couldn't even define the word reconciliation or the word atonement, much less understand that it is for them and they need it, but they're going to receive it. And brethren, we see the ceremony in Leviticus 16 that points to this event was instituted over 1,000 years before Jesus walked the earth. And about 2,000 years after his death and resurrection, we are soon to see this day being fulfilled. The Feast of Trumpets is to occur, then next, and that's Jesus coming, and that's the next event that is to occur. And then the Day of Atonement can be fulfilled. We have to have trumpets before atonement, and we have to have atonement before the 1,000-year reign of Jesus Christ, i.e. the Feast of Tabernacles. That's another topic. But I do want you to go with me now to Revelation 20. I referred to this earlier, but didn't make any comment. I did that intentionally. Where we are going to see this scenario that is talked about here is soon to occur. I want us to understand this is symbolically pictured by the Day of Atonement. Leviticus 23. They tie together the 2 points. They're not the same event, but, you know, it's like one of my daughters used to say, sort of, kind of, but not really. You know. But let's go to Revelation 20 and beginning in verse 4. And I saw an angel come down from heaven having a key to the bottomless pit and a great chain on his head. And he laid hand on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years. Okay, that's what I said. And cast him into the bottomless pit and shut him up and set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. And after that he must be loosed a little season. Okay. I'm not going back, just mentally carry you back to the Azazel goat in Leviticus 16. He's carried out into the wilderness. He wasn't killed or destroyed or removed. This is why. This is why. Because that goat pictures Satan, and groups are saying that it pictures both. It doesn't, but anyway, that goat is taken out in there because it is a symbolism of he's going to be in the wilderness. I mean, he's going to be out in the wilderness, which is symbolic of the 1,000 years when he's put into this bottomless pit, i.e. the Feast of Tabernacles, the 1,000-year reign of Jesus Christ. Then we move on. And I saw thrones, and they sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them. And I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus, and for the word of God, in which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither had received his mark upon their foreheads or in their hands. And they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Then the 1,000 years happened. This is what it says. And then we read earlier, and cast him, this is in verse 3, and shut him up and set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more until the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. And after that he must be loosed for a little season. The time is coming that he needs to be released. So the symbolism of the goat being carried out into the wilderness, it's symbolic of this day, of this actually happening. But any way you want to look at this, today we are so privileged to observe this special day. This day that God has made holy, filled with all kinds of symbolisms, all kinds of pictures, all kinds of things that He's going to carry out. This day is not just an inconvenient day on the way to the Feast of Tabernacles. And we get lost sometimes in trying to read and put together all the symbolisms, and so that's why we need to look at them. We need to take a look at these, and this is why we did. We also understand, as we have this privilege to be able to observe and celebrate this special day, we also realize today we're told to fast. Why? Why? Well, for many reasons. And first and foremost, God said so. If he didn't even explain it, we should do it because he said so. Now, he doesn't just say so. We actually know a lot more why. But first and foremost, to me, the biggest reason we fast is because God said so. And whatever God says, we could go, yes, sir. It's like Paul when he's knocked down on the road to Damascus. Jesus knocks him down. We know it's Jesus because he identifies himself there. And he knocks him down and he blinds him and he says, Lord, who are you and what do you want me to do? Implying whatever God said, that's what he was saying he was going to do. Well, God said to fast on this day. Okay, yes, sir, we're going to fast. And then Jesus explains things to Paul. Well, just like God explains things to us. It's commended that we afflict or humble ourselves, and the purpose of that for us is to draw close to God. We also fast because the day pictures our entering God's presence. Because, see, man was cut off. This is the day that pictures that we have access to God. And we humble ourselves before God. Yeah, he said to do it, but I'm saying we do it because we are humbling ourselves, bowing down ourselves, figuratively speaking, symbolically speaking, as low as we can get before our great God because we're in his presence. I'm going to digress because this just came to my mind and I don't know why. But I know I've heard people, somewhat criticizing people, the quote Protestant churches who say, we're going to go up into heaven. They just got the location wrong, but that's not my point. And we're going to look in the face of God for all eternity. And I've had people laugh at it. I've heard ministers from the pulpit laugh at people who are saying that. And I remember going up it wasn't the first time, it was probably the second or third time I heard a minister say that. I went up to him and asked him, and I said, I want to ask you a question. I said, give me the downside of being in the presence of God and looking into his face for all eternity. And he couldn't say anything. And I said, of course that's not true. But what if that was it? Would you not want to be there? Man is going to have, through this day, access to God they've never had before. And so we also fast because this pictures when all mankind will have access to God. We fast for the rest of humanity. They don't know it. They may laugh at us. They may ridicule us. They may fire you from a job. They may do all kinds of things. And those are the people that we still fast for. Because we know they don't have the truth. We fast, we humble ourselves, and we do it because God said so. We do it because we humble ourselves to draw closer to God, because we see that we are picturing, this day pictures our entering into God's presence, and we fast for all of humanity. Think about it this way, what an awesome and loving God we have. Jesus died for us. I think we can at least do without a couple of meals for all who do not understand. What is pictured by this day? So, brethren, any way you want to look at this day, the Day of Atonement is a glorious and wonderful day. Therefore, it is a great day for rejoicing. I think each one of us need to thank God. Yes, even as the stomach rumbles, even as we may have a headache because of whatever reason, all of those things, we're still alive. We're human. We're in the presence of God. So I think each one of us need to take time and thank God that we are here today, that we're part of this celebration of this awesome day that God created. The Aaronic blessing. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto Aaron and to his sons, saying, On this wise you shall bless the children of Israel, saying unto them, The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. And they shall put my name upon the children of Israel, and I will bless them. Those words have so much meaning for the Day of Atonement. I hope we see that and we realize that. And thank God that we are here. Brethren, I pray that you will all have a very safe and profitable, inspiring, and wonderful Feast of Tabernacles and last great day wherever it is that you may attend. And so we love you. God bless you all. Happy Holy Day.